welcome. Hi, I see some of you. As you're coming in, go ahead and just drop your name and where you're joining us from in the chat so we can have a sense of who you are even before we tell you a little bit about who we are. But just want to say that we are grateful. We are grateful that you're here. My name is Michaela, and this is the webinar about inner work of a leader. And my goodness, if there has ever been a year where I know that I have had to feel and go deeper and consider and ask tough questions, this has been a year. And so in actually chatting with my friend Lisa, who is joining us, who is the CEO of Tamim Partners, we started talking about what would it look like to gather and talk and host a webinar and usher people into some of the conversations we've been having, consider together the practices that are important in this time, and even think really strategically and mindfully about what we're not doing. We brainstormed this webinar as just that kind of space to really take in a breath as we go through this last month of 2020, or if you happen to be watching this later in 2021, to be starting out the year well. I see we literally are having participants from all over the world. I'm noticing in the chat. It's good, really good to have you all here. And then we're like, who else? Who else can help us think about the inner life of a leader? And that's when our friends Inez and Tracy came to mind. Inez is a pastor, a reconciler. I feel like you're like an Instagram pastor in some ways, Inez. I just want to say the Church We Hope For, a church that she is co-planting and co-founding with another really fantastic human, Bobby Harrison. If you have Instagram or the internet, which I'm guessing you may have both, if you're here with us today, I would encourage you to check her out. Inez is also a Fuller chaplain and writes for us in Life for Leaders, so you can experience some of her writing there. And Tracy Matthews, who is the executive director of the Call to Work, and who Lisa and I actually together have sat through Tracy's cohorts in which she helps people attune to the voice of God in their everyday work, which is also how I've come to know and experience Lisa more deeply. Lisa does a lot in her role at Tamim, but mostly consulting and vocational coaching. Each one of these women, including myself, we have a different set of background and experience, and really interestingly overlapping between business and spiritual direction, pastoring and consulting, which feels just kind of like the mix of the Pree Center. And if you're new to the Pree Center for any reason, we exist to help leaders, particularly leaders across different industries, think about their life and their faith and their work, and to go deeper, especially in this season of challenge. In just a minute, by the way, if you have a pen or paper handy, take notes on your phone, grab that. In just a minute, Tracy is actually going to lead us in an exercise. But let me just give you a little bit of the flow today, and then I will hand it over to Tracy for the first thing we're going to do. At any point along the way, if you have questions, we would love for you to throw those in the Q&A. The Q&A, if you're on a computer, is at the bottom of your screen. If you're on an iPad, I think it's the top right. On a phone, it's just somewhere in there. If you're savvy enough to be doing a webinar on a phone, I believe you're savvy enough to find the Q&A spot as well. So I trust that. Drop any question you have, any thought, anything you're wondering, and we would love to pick that up in dialogue and conversation. We are going to actually start in just a second with a practice, and then we're going to move into a time of just observing together like what we've noticed. Each of us in our own spheres walks alongside leaders, and we are leaders ourselves. And in that way, we have the honor and of bearing witness to a lot that's going on in people's lives. So we're going to share some of those observations, and then we're going to have a conversation that we're going to, that I think is going to be interesting, and I'm hopeful of that, about what we're not doing in this season, what we're not doing the rest of 2020 in order to make space for what matters, in order to make space for what it is we want to do and we want to focus on. So that'll sort of be the rhythm. And then we will end again with this exercise. Now, let me say, right as I hand over to Tracy, if you are like me and you're a little bit introverted, don't worry. Like, we're not going to call on you. You're not going to have to like talk during this exercise. It's very introvert friendly. So like, take a deep breath if that causes you any sort of classroom or webinar anxiety. And we're just glad you're here. We're so very grateful that you're here. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tracy.
Excellent. Thank you, Michaela. And thanks all for joining us. It is just so good to be a part of this. As Michaela mentioned, we're going to kick things off by inviting everyone to just try out a simple practice we'll call listening for guideposts. And our goal for this practice is twofold. One is that we hope it will help you walk away with a deeper sense of one or two key themes or takeaways you most sense God has for you. And second, we hope that this is a practice that you can take away in and of itself, a helpful practice that you can use in future situations as a way to continue to develop and cultivate your ability to listen well and deeply. So this is what we want you to do. It's real simple. We want you to be, as the conversation is unfolding here, we want you to be listening for words or phrases or even concepts that stand out to you, that resonate as something God may want you to notice. We're hoping that throughout this webinar, you might end up with, 5 or 10 or maybe even more different words or phrases or concepts that have stood out to you, and you'll just write those down or type them into your phone, however works best for you. And this sense of resonance can come in many different ways. It might be simply something you find just interesting or stimulating. It might be something that causes some kind of stirring within you, a response. It might be an emotional response. It might be more of a physical response. It just jumped out at me. I have this gut sense that maybe I should be paying attention to it. It caused me to lean forward or maybe even to recoil a little bit. So positive or negative, it can come in many different ways, but just looking for something that stirs something within you. And then later on towards the back end of this webinar, I'll guide you through some simple prompts to help you discern one or two key themes or guideposts you most sense God has for you. And with that, I will just note that this is a new practice, I'm guessing, for many of you, including the 3 others, Michaela, Inez, and Lisa. I don't believe that you've done this particular exercise before, so we'll get to try it out real time. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end, a chance to share about what particular experience has been. But just we want to note that this idea of trying out new practices, finding out which ones work best for us, and kind of leading further into those, I consider this to be just a huge part of the inner work. Is this, what are the practices that help us to intentionally cultivate the way we want to show up in the world, the way we want to respond, the way we want to approach the situations we're facing. So with that, I will turn it over back to Michaela.
Thank you, Tracy. You actually have been such a guide for me in my growing attunement, to use your word, to all that God is trying to say to us and to me. So I am looking forward to practicing in this way, tuning in, even in this hour together. So I would love to just open it up for all of us, and the 3 of you in particular, to the question that we sort of, as these things go, you sort of send some emails back and forth ahead of time, and you're like, what should we talk about? What feels most pressing? And one thing we landed on as a group was to talk through some of our observations about this season. Like I said, each one of us in our own sphere does a lot of walking alongside leaders and leading in our own right. And it's just been a tough year, really, for everybody. And that toughness has played out in certain ways in the lives of leaders. And so if we were doing like a bit of a state of the union, like what does it feel like to be a Christian leader right now in this moment in 2020? I'm curious just to dig in on some of our observations. Lisa, how would you feel about kicking us off?
Sure, I'm happy to kick us off. Thanks, Michaela, and thanks, Tracy. This is going to be fun to see if I can talk and pay attention to what other people are saying at the same time. which is one of the challenges, right? In this COVID world, there's a lot of stuff swirling around. I think the biggest challenge for leaders is stepping into places of unknown and complexity, and stepping away from problem solving. You know, the problems that we're currently facing are not, we can't solve them. Many of them, at least, they're not within our control to solve immediately. And yet there are things we can do in our own environments to really learn what's working, what's not working from our people. I think, you know, early on, a psychologist, therapist friend of mine said, you know, this was back in April, he said, you know, I think as a country and as a world even, we're all experiencing, he used the phrase collective social trauma, right? So this is a shared experience for all of us. It's impacting everybody. Some more than others, some more painfully than others, you know, lots of people out of work, lots of folks, you know, not sure about, you know, where their next meals are coming from in some cases. And financially, it's been a burden on many people. But at the end of the day, no matter where you are, this has created some sort of trauma and anxiety. So if you're operating from that place and you're leading people, you're going to communicate further anxiety to them, right? So what's going on inside of us doesn't stay contained when you're in a leadership role. How you show up and how you engage your people is, you know, they'll see it, they'll experience it from you. And so I think the work, and why I was so taken with this conversation, is, you know, the inner work from a leadership perspective has to be, it's not that we're not anxious or feeling angst or even pain and loss. In many cases, for many of us, we've lost people to this disease or to implications from, you know, other things around it. But how we manage that is very challenging. And that's where the work is. And I've seen different leaders address that very differently, certainly in their own practices. You know, one of the hardest things, I think, and then I'll pass the mic off to Tracy or Inez, is, and this I think we all learned this early on, you know, we quickly jumped into Zoom land, right? Knowing that we could virtually conference, and that was a really powerful tool that quickly accelerated our ability to continue to be productive. And I think many of us shot ourselves in the foot, right? Because you can start Zooming at 7 o'clock in the morning and go straight through till 8 o'clock at night, particularly if you're dealing across time zones without any breaks. And we're actually diminishing our ability to process and take in information and respond effectively when we're, you know, doing 9 or 10 or 11 hours of Zoom calls a day. So it felt more productive, but it actually isn't. And learning that lesson is a really hard one for a lot of leaders, to say, okay, I can only have so much that I do in this virtual format on a daily basis. Sometimes it's even better. I know this is going to sound very old fashioned, but just pick up the phone and call someone. You can be more effective in your communication on a phone call. And I saw a lot of leaders use Zoom as a format for early on for kind of cracking the whip and setting expectations around what they thought their people should be doing. And a lot of that has shifted. We can talk more about that in a little bit, but I think that's been one of the real challenges, is how do I manage not just my time, but my energy effectively in the midst of this, so that I can communicate to my people that it's okay for them to manage their own as well.
I'd love to piggyback on that. I would echo the observation about greater unknowns, anxiety, and just add that quite often, you know, the jump into productivity can be a way to try and manage our own anxiety.
Yeah.
But also, you know, the impact of anxiety does tend to cause us to kind of isolate or withdraw in terms of meaningful, deeper connection. So what I'm finding is quite important is to really create that space and encourage people towards the deeper connection with others, with God, even with themselves. It's a kind of slower, deeper work, which can be kind of opposite of that. I want to be more productive. So I would kind of add that to what you said, Lisa.
Yeah.
I think I would add to what Lisa and Tracy are saying is that my work as a chaplain at Fuller Seminary with students, staff, and faculty, my work as a local pastor and training other pastors from the West Coast to the East Coast, the rhyme is the same. The rhyme of grief is the same. Like Lisa was saying, we are dealing with what we call in our workshops, when I do workshops with the other chaplains at Fuller, with collective grief, sustained grief, and compounded grief. And the challenge is to be able to self-regulate our own grief.
Yeah.
And to be able to name what is happening in us, like we are all saying. And then I've had to learn to turn grief into a resilient place. Grief to see grief as a friend, to see grief as a gift, and to see grief as a means of grace. My own, I've had to self-regulate and to know that I have to cohabitate with grief. Like it is a friend. It is living here in my living room. It is paying rent. And to be able to move from grief to a place of growth, that those points of pain, those pressure points, to be able to name, okay, this grief today, where is it coming from, requires an attentiveness like Tracy is teaching us to do today. Today's grief, where is it coming from?
Yeah.
Because we are cohabitating with grief and we have different habitats. Is it our mental health? Is it our workplace? Is it our relationships? Is it if we are caregivers of parents or other older people who are sick and elderly, or if we have children at home? We're not working from home is what I say. I'm taking my child to work every day as I'm switching from screens, and I'm carrying his emotions as well. And so as we do that, the challenge is for us to be not a non-anxious centering presence. It requires that self-regulation, and then to teach other leaders to do the same. What we are seeing, like the greatest angst that I'm seeing in other pastors, for example, is that they are carrying not just their own grief in their own homes, but everybody else's as well. That means we're living in a state of survival, and that is not normal.
Yeah.
That is absolutely not normal. Our bodies and our minds and our hearts and our souls, and nothing is light. And so if we had grief prior to COVID, pre-COVID, we brought all that with us. And then on top of that, it is multiple layers of grief. So to be able to switch from from disappointment to determination requires a friendship with grief and a relationship with grief to be able to be that non-anxious centering presence.
I think that's right. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about over the last couple of years, but certainly it's become more, even more present in this season, is I do think we need to recapture as people of Christian faith, our ability and our willingness to go to the place of lament, right? Lament is the release of grief. It's letting it out. And I think we are enculturated to not grieve or to skip past it, no matter what the loss is, or diminish our loss in comparison to someone else's. Well, what Inez is going through is worse than what I'm going through. So I'll just set it aside over here. And if we do that, it comes back to us, right? It doesn't get integrated into new resilience and new adaptability. But I think recapturing lament is a really important part of this. And the Bible has an awful lot to say about lament, and we could, unpack that, but it is the ability to let grief be expressed.
Yes.
Right? And in a healthy way. But part of it is to release it, right? Not to keep pulling it back in again, but to release it so that we can integrate it and move past it, because there are things that some of us are grieving that we'll grieve for our lifetimes. I'm not trying to diminish it, but to give us a way to release some of it so that we can move on.
That's so wonderful, Lisa. I'm so glad that you reminded us of lament. A third of the Psalms are lament.
Yeah.
And often we are so, we have been so conditioned to suppress our emotions when God has gifted them to us in order to come before God and say, God, I am angry right now. God, I am sad right now. God, I am frustrated and disappointed right now. And to see that these feelings are actually God's way to access us. But if I suppress it, like you say, if I say, well, my pain is less than Lisa's, that comparison will kill our healing opportunity. That's right. And to be able to say, I come with all of this, God has access to us when we're able to name the feeling. Tracy's teaching us to name and be attentive to name what it is. God has access to me through my anger. It's actually a good thing so that I don't stay in that anger. And lament is both a spiritual practice, and from my tradition as a Latina, as a Nicaraguan, is a cultural practice. And I think lamentation leads to liberation if we work through the process. Thank you.
Yeah, very good.
I just want to grab a couple of things that you all said that were so helpful and run with them. First, Inez, you said three things about like you categorize grief in three ways early on. What do you remember what those three labels were? What?
Collective, compounded, and sustained.
Yeah, collective. It was that one. Collective, compounded, and sustained. That's really just interesting. I want to just capture that framework again. One thing that's been fascinating. So I used to surf back when, like, I didn't have two children and had like time to do such things like surfing. And I actually learned to surf in Hawaii. And the very first like rule of the water was learning to read the waves. And you would always learn which wave was the wave in the set that you wanted to drop in on. And there's usually sets of 4 waves, and you could count the seconds between them. And it would be like, okay, it's a 12-second break between the waves, and that'll help me prepare to, get on. One thing I've noticed, the grief that you all are talking about that we're naming here for leaders, it's coming in waves, right? It's just like, it's washing. And I'm wondering, just like your observations about, is there any way to prepare for that, to anticipate that more of it's coming, and to not be as caught off guard, to sort of know that, we are cohabitating with it, like just that not only dealing with what was and what is, but anticipating what might come as leaders in this. I'm wondering if you could just all speak to that just for a minute.
I can start. I really want to hear from Tracy and Inez on this as well. I don't know that you can prepare for it necessarily. I think human nature is such that we get sideswiped when something happens that causes us to be sad and to grieve, no matter how big or small it is. And if you've done some work, so the preparation is not, standing there fiercely waiting for the wave to smack you. The preparation is all the training and practice that you did, knowing how to read the waves, right? And saying, okay, this one's going to come every 12 seconds. So I got to do something different than I would if it's coming every 20 seconds or every 5 seconds. And that's why this kind of inner work is so important, because that actually is the preparation. And the last thing I'll say is, I think the hardest thing for most leaders to say and believe is, it's certainly the hardest thing for them to say is, I don't know what to do. So the practice here is really humility, right? Like recognizing we can't be the answer person in all of these circumstances, and really allowing other people to engage differently than they did before, and be willing to say, I don't know, which makes you feel very vulnerable when you're in a leadership position. But that vulnerability is what allows you then to catch the next wave, right? And be able to at least make some kind of progress forward. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what it sparked for me.
I'll jump in. I like what you said, Lisa, about the idea of not just standing there waiting for the wave to smack you.
Yeah.
But to be willing to have your eyes open to it and not brace against it. So much as look to move with it. And some of the stuff we've been talking about, especially Inez here, in terms of really being willing to kind of sit in the pain, go deeper into the pain, really express more to the fullest extent possible what it is that's going on and what it is that hurts so badly to God, and then letting God speak back into it, because what you've done is you've just opened yourself up that much deeper to God. And he is, constantly expressing himself. So his ability to speak into the depths of our being can actually be enhanced by something like this. I just find some comfort in knowing that God will use it to connect with me more deeply.
Yeah.
I love what you both said, Lisa and Tracy, and I do agree that there's no way to prepare for the grief except knowing that that there's work to do with that grief, and so carving out the spaces where we are able to, there's different phases of grief,
Sure.
and knowing that we cycle in and out of them at different points. It's not linear, but it's circular, and that through different points of the pain we'll enter into grief and to do the work and exit. And so knowing that that is circular and having the attentiveness and the tools to know, how do I work my grief? How do I work through it, and how do I do the work of grief? And of course, therapists and counselors help us do that work as well, but finding in our own temperament the time and the space, and we can talk about later in the rule of life, which is what has helped me, is to find a rule of life, a rhythm of life that carves out time for grief, that actually carves out time for lament.
That's right.
Ever since COVID started, I carve out time for lament, even if it's just silence and sitting and saying, when was the last time that I cried? What am I feeling right now?
Yeah.
And to see those spiritual practices that are most in tune to us and our temperament to do the work of grief. So we can't prepare for it, and we cycle in and out through it. So even those waves, we may know when they're coming, and then we don't know when they're coming, just knowing, oh, here's another wave. So when the wave comes, what's the work of grief that I have to do? So if that makes any sense.
That's right. I want to add one last comment, and then I know we're going to move on. I think, and as what you've just described is so important, that creating the space for the grief, because otherwise we carry it with us all the time, right? It can overwhelm us.
Yes.
But if knowing we have a space that we can take it to intentionally, I think it does help us to manage in the other things we have to be responsible for and get done during the course of the day. Otherwise, the grief can just completely overwhelm us. So if we give it permission to have a space to go to, in some ways, it's not containing it necessarily. That's not what I'm trying to say, but we can create a rhythm around it that begins to help us process through it.
That's so good.
So the word space is coming up a lot now, right? And it's kind of like, we need space. I have a question in mind. I'm actually gonna weave a really good question that we got in Q&A into it. So it's gonna be a multi-part. So if you're at the end of it, you're like, you just asked me 7 things, you just run with which one you want to, okay? In the chat, we got a question just about like the distinction between what we're grieving personally and what we're grieving collectively. And is there, especially in our roles as leaders, however that's expressed, as a parent, as a friend, as the CEO of a 300-person organization, right? Is there importance and distinction in making separate space for those two things, and how do we do that? So that's kind of part 1, which I think is a really good question. But in this space part, I'm struck by the concept of, in order to have in our very full lives, right? Even in COVID times, they're full in their own way. We've got to say no to certain things so that we can say yes to other things. And I'm wondering, like, what are we not doing? What are we saying no to? Whether it's like the actual things in our schedule or the certain emotions that try to go to less helpful places. Like what are we saying no to so that we can have this kind of space? So the individual and the collective grief, right? How do we distinguish? And then what are we, and then moving into, what are we saying no to? How are we ensuring that we will have the space we need to do the work that you all are talking about?
I love the question about the individual and collective. I think that's very important because of this collective grief, and it's compounded, so it has so many layers. One way that my mentor helped me to see this, I was in a cohort of other women who have a heart for racial reconciliation. And she talked to us about circle of concern and
Mm.
circle of influence. Our circle
Mhm.
of concern right now covers the whole screen right now, covers the
Yeah.
whole world right now. Our circle of concern is wide and deep. It is global. It is a global pandemic. There's not one person that's not experiencing this pandemic. I've never lived in a time in history right now where
Mhm.
not one person is not experiencing some impact. And then within that, other layers, there's racial injustice, racial trauma if you live in the United
Mhm.
States. There's hurricanes in my country of Nicaragua, great circle of concern.
Mhm.
And that can overwhelm me because I want to fix the whole entire world, right? But my circle of influence is to realize, where do I actually have influence? The same heart from the circle of concern, but to realize, where's my circle of influence,
Right.
my workplace, my relationships. Am I caring for a child? Am I caring for a parent? My community as a pastor, or and to look at the actual places where I have influence, and to be able to manage my energy, the realistic time and effort
Yeah.
and energy that I have, and say, here's my circle of concern. I care about all these things, but if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority.
Right.
And then to look at the circle of influence and separate those two and say, here's where I have influence. Right now, all that I may have energy to do is cook a meal for my neighbor, or, or just take care of children, or an elderly couple, or my parents, or whatever it is, or I'm just barely making it at work, and to be okay with that. So what I'm
Yeah.
not doing is trying to save the world.
The world.
And what
Right.
I am doing is, I have to say this to myself often because of all the multiple hats that I wear. All I can do is all I can do. And it
Mhm.
doesn't mean that I don't care. It just means that I am not God,
Yeah.
and I'm limited. And I like to think that I'm Superwoman, and all of us are,
Yeah.
but I am limited, and I'm not Superwoman either. And so I'm not
Yeah.
trying to do all the things, but to do small circle of concern. I'm sorry, circle of influence. Do those small things well, as well as I can.
It's so great you said that. I actually printed this out. I don't know if you all can see this. I'll hold it up in my screen. So I use this tool as well. And I have an even smaller circle in the middle, which is the circle of actual control.
Ooh,
And one
tell
of
us
those
about
things
that,
I'm
Lisa. Tell me about my
Very
control.
small.
Yeah,
It's very
it's
small.
very small, the
So
control
small.
part. So, and I think I have found it to be such a valuable tool to help people really, is this a concern? Can I influence this, or is this something that's actually in my control, right? And there's very little, as we all know, if we're honest with ourselves, that's in our control, but I can do things about that, right? I can fix the meal. I can help my child with homework. I can take the dog for a walk. I can get up and leave my computer and say no more Zoom calls for today. And all of that. And that's one of the things I'm seeing in a lot of workplaces that I think is really helpful, as this work from home has become so prevalent, is that many organizations, I did a call about a month ago with several hundred lawyers, if you can imagine. Just imagine that for a minute. And talking about, this need to go to the place of the unknown in complexity. But one of the things that many law firms who are all working remotely right now have put in place is a very narrow number of hours on a daily basis that their practicing attorneys and their staff need to be available, because they want to give people a lot more freedom who are trying to navigate children from home. So they might have to be available from 10 to 12 and 2 to 4, and that's it. And they can do the rest of their work however it makes sense to them, which I think that gives people some degree of control, right? So from a leadership perspective, what is the thing we can do that gives people some sense of control over their environment in the midst of this? Sounds like a silly little thing, but it made a huge difference in the effectiveness of people trying to navigate work from home with families and other obligations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa.
Tracy, what about you? What about like how are you noticing what to say no to, what to not do, whether it's thinking about these circles of influence and concern and that little itty bitty circle of control, or something else? Like what about you?
I would bring it, well, surprise, I'd bring it back to discernment. In terms of what is the work God has for me to do.
Mhm.
And even in the hour by hour, is it time to put this work down right now? Is it time to lean in, on which aspect of the priority list? And that I find to be very helpful. And what I'm not doing is worrying about whatever doesn't show up at the very top of that list. What I would also add to that is this idea of not holding on to expectations or outcomes or plans. I mean, the planning is still very important, but anytime we're leading into new territory, especially when there's just so much unknown, it can be very unhelpful to try and hold on to the plans that we've made. And I find that as I'm able kind of more in the moment to hold agendas really loosely, it really does provide more bandwidth in the moment to really listen more deeply and well, to be attuned not only to God, but to the context that is itself unfolding. So I would say that the whole not doing is holding on tightly to just about anything except for kind of the general direction I think God has me pointed.
That's really good.
So good.
Susan, I know Susie, so I'm veering from her Zoom name and calling her Susie instead of Susan, has a really good question that I think is kind of a next step and a bridge here for us. And that's that people grieve differently. People need space differently. People process differently. People tune in to God differently. And, sometimes leaders are leading in Christian institutions, but many of our folks are leading in places where, like, we just don't talk about God in the workplace in the same way. It's just not the sort of social rules. So the conversation we just had was about what we're not doing and how we're able to think about that. But how do we lead others in this? How do we lead others in these differences in grief, these differences in needs for space, these differences in processes, bearing in mind that sometimes, like, we can talk about God, other times we can't, and that's just sort of the way of the world. Like, how do we lead in this kind of space in addition to attending to ourselves as leaders?
I think the hardest work that leaders should do, and many don't do this, is to really pay attention and understand two things: the relational and emotional systems that exist in their organization. So how do people relate to one another? What's the general emotional tenor of the team or the organization? And then the second is to really spend time getting to know their people, right? So that they can understand that Tracy requires this, and Inez requires this, and Michaela requires this, and be generous with your ability to try and accommodate that. You can't always, but it could be, Tracy, I know you need time to process some things. And so, I'm not going to bug you about this project or that until tomorrow. If I can be helpful to you in any way, please let me do that. I think searching for a one size fits all solution for this for everybody isn't going to work. We have to do harder work relationally and emotionally with our people. And you can do all that work in an environment that doesn't have a lot of space for faith, but you can demonstrate it by how you engage and care for the people that God has entrusted to you in that environment.
That's so powerful, Lisa. I think what I'm hearing Lisa say is that we're having to remember how to be human.
Yeah.
We may not be able to use whatever Christianese language or whatever handles or tools our Christian worldview has given us to deal with grief, but what Lisa's saying is remember how to be human.
Mm-hmm.
And to be human is to know that we are each a story, and so knowing each other's stories, knowing and listening. Dr. Scott Kermode says at Fuller, leadership begins with listening.
Yeah.
As a human universal experience to listen and to ask the questions, how are you really doing?
Yeah.
what things and what tools do you need? How can I help you in this project? Do you need extra help during this time? My husband is a project manager and manages multiple teams, and I hear how he speaks to his people because he's in the other room, you know, and he doesn't work in a Christian environment, but he's asking, how can I help you in this project? I see that you're falling behind. Is there something going on at home? Oh, and then he hears the stories of my grandmother just died. The third person in my family just passed away from COVID. And so we're having to listen in that deeper listening to each of our stories and to cultivate empathy as a tool in the workplace.
Yeah.
To know that we are all under functioning, probably. We're all fractured and fragmented. And if we're under functioning, it has nothing to do with our intellect or intelligence, but just our capacity, because we're living with sustained grief and on survival mode. And so how to become human and help each other out in the workplace, that's part of doing the work of grief and strengthening those human relationships. And that's part of responding collectively to collective grief, and not just think, well, I'm just going to deal with my own, I have enough with myself. But when we help each other out with that tool of empathy, that muscle of empathy, we are all stronger because we raise the tide, right? And it raises all the boats. So I love what you're saying, Lisa. Remembering how to be human maybe is
yeah, that's it in a nutshell. That's perfect.
Speaking of boats, perhaps, what's interesting here is we're describing this like, as leaders, this capacity to manage anxiety, manage reactivity, make friends with grief, and at the same time, exercise empathy, demonstrate compassion, remember what it means to be human towards other people. And I'm struck by just like, you know, Inez's earlier sort of charge. I don't remember who said humility. Someone had said humility, but then Inez said, like, I have to remember I'm not God. I'm actually not Superwoman. And so what we're describing is like quite the set of tasks, right? To be moving between. And why I said, speaking of boats, and I'll give this example and then parlay it to the rest of you. When my son, I have two kids, when my son was 6 weeks old, we had a friend going through just a personal crisis, and that friend needed to come live on our couch. And if anyone has ever been around small children, you may know that when a baby is 6 weeks old is not an ideal time to have someone come live on the couch in terms of sleep and chaos and etc. But there we were, and that was life, and that's what needed to happen. And these two very intense things needed to coexist. And many days in, so what would happen is I would literally tend to my son and feed him by day and by night, and in between listen to my friends and sit and, you know, process what was going on. And after many days of this, I felt very overwhelmed. I felt very overwhelmed in dealing with my own very full reality, and also extending ongoing compassion to somebody else. And so I called my mama, which is what I do when I feel overwhelmed. And she said, Michaela, you're taking on a lot of water. You're a little boat and you're taking on a lot of water. And you need to intentionally let water off that boat. And so I was like, oh, of course there's holes in my boat. Of course I'm letting water on, and I'm not letting any water off. And that became, not only in that moment, a mantra to be able to sleep and not go insane as a human being, but a leadership mantra for me that will probably remain with me, is that the stuff that we're describing, the empathy that we're commissioning each other to extend and towards one another, and the self-awareness to cohabitate with grief and to manage our reactivity, it's a lot of taking on water, and we have to work to intentionally let that water off. And that has felt so incredibly important for me in 2020. And so I'm wondering if each of us can share. So we talked about things we're not doing. I'll call that my thing I am doing, is letting water off the boat. I'm wondering if each of us, you know, before we end up doing, you know, sort of the rest of Tracy's hands-on practice, if we can each name a thing we are doing to help with that rhythm as we lead in these times.
One thing that I am doing and have been doing since the beginning of COVID and trying to teach others to do is to find we call a rule of life. A rule of life is not something that I invented. It was, and it's an ancient ethic of that started in monasteries by monks who lived a reflective lifestyle, but wanted to see how their work and their witness um, had to do with boundaries and rhythms of grace. And so a rule of life is not about rigidity. So I hate that the word rule is there, because those of us who go, oh, rules, we need to create something rigid. It's not about rigidity, but rhythms, and rhythms that can hold us and uphold us. And it's not about balance, because balance is a myth and does not exist. It is about boundaries, realistic and gentle boundaries. And the way that helps me understand what a rule of life is, it's like a trellis. A trellis is like a railing that provides structure and support. A trellis lifts up a grapevine, right? And so it lifts up the grapevine so that light and air and space and rest can lift up the grapevine so that it can bear fruit. And so a rhythm of life, and I call it, there's different ways to describe a rule of life, but it's basically finding those things that I don't need to be doing, and then finding those things that I do need to be doing in the 168 hours that I have of my week that I do have control over. So think about your circle of control. You do have control over what you put into your 168 hours of a week. Right. And so I don't have it with me, but it looks like just columns and lines. I call it a rule of three. 3 things that I can do daily, 3 things that I can do weekly, 3 things that I can do monthly to be able to sustain me and uphold me. I don't think we have the rhythms of life that can sustain our work, sustain our calling, sustain our vocation. And so what are those rhythms so that when the rains come, we don't scramble and go, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We already have that trellis that is sustaining us. We already have those places where we can go, well, here's another wave. We're going to go into this place. And so finding those things that are life-giving and deleting those things that are not life-giving, finding those things that are joy-giving and deleting those things that are just taking away the energy that we need. So a few examples of those things. It's again, those boundaries, right? Rhythms, soft and gentle rhythms. When I wake up in the mornings, there's my rocking chair over there, and I just go sit there with my cup of coffee. I don't have time to sit there for an hour, but sometimes it's just 5 minutes in my rocking chair. So I say 1 rocking chair a day, and that may just be 5 minutes of silence. Sometimes I'm sitting and reading something. Sometimes I'm listening to music. Sometimes I'm just sitting in silence. Rhythms and boundaries of, I try not to check social media the first hour that I pick up my phone. This is a weapon of mass distraction and source of stress. And I have found it was really hard to do, to not pick up this phone the first hour. I mean, I look to see what time it is and it wakes me up, but to not look at social media because it immediately takes me into a place of anxiety. So 1 hour in the morning and then the last hour of the night, I don't look at social media. So there's boundaries with my phone because it can be a source of stress. Boundaries with how much news I take in. And so rules of life that affect your work, your self-care, your soul care, and your relationships. A funny rule of life is I dance once a day with my son. I say, okay, my son, his name is Nash. What song do you want to dance with mommy? And we dance in the kitchen. We did that last night, super late, by the way. And we just danced to find those moments where we can just find things that are life-giving, but also things that can help me with my day to create those rhythms, whether it's spiritual practices or communal things that we do here as a family. Go outside for walks, go outside and just sit in the sun. So a rule of life has saved me, and we need rules of life for different seasons of life, and we need one desperately right now during this time of sustained pandemic. So
I think that's right. I'll just echo. I know we have to get back to Tracy here in a minute and have her finish us out, but I do think that ability to really get clear on what's life-giving and what isn't, and let go of the things that are not, and do more of the things that are. I don't know why we hold ourselves captive to the things that drain, suck us dry, but we do, right? And when you can identify them and recognize them, it creates space to do a little bit more of the things that are life-giving. I started hiking in last March when COVID started on a regular basis with a friend of mine. I'm not a great hiker. I wouldn't consider myself a great outdoors person, but hiking, doing a long hike once a week was a game changer for me. Sadly, I also started baking bread, which was very life-giving, but I will tell you that the bread baking did not exactly get counterbalanced by the hiking in terms of caloric intake, but they were both life-giving activities, right? There's something very lovely. I think baking bread became a thing, right? Because for a while you couldn't find yeast anywhere in the grocery stores. But I do think there's something very life-giving about a loaf of a pile of dough, you know, rising on your stove and going into the oven, and you're producing something that's good and lovely and you can eat a lot of with olive oil or warm butter on it. But those were life-giving activities, right? And so finding them and doing more of them and letting go of the things that are not. I stopped sleeping. I don't sleep with my phone in my room at all. I can't do it. So I use an old-fashioned alarm clock to get up in the morning. Just can't do it because
Awesome.
it's too distracting for me. I'm not good enough to not look at it when I get out of bed in the morning. So my whole morning routine doesn't include the phone. So it's a game changer, actually.
That is such good stuff. Really quickly, what I'd add to something I'm practicing a lot is simply noticing what stirs stronger reactions, especially overreactions. And then as soon as I'm able, if I'm in the moment, great. If not, later on that night or the next morning, take some time to dig deeper. See if I can surface more of the underlying dynamics. I've heard it talked about as like, hey, the overreactions are, it's like the check engine light. That's a time to check underneath the hood. So that's been super helpful lately. And with that, as we're wrapping up our time, Michaela, would this be a good time to move into the back half for practice? All right. Okay, so hopefully you guys have been jotting down words, phrases, ideas, or concepts. If you haven't, don't worry, just continue on with us. So the first thing I'd like you to do at this point is just close your eyes. We take a couple of deep breaths. The idea here is to cool the parts of our minds that are busily trying to figure stuff out so that we can adopt a more receiving, perceiving, growing in awareness stance. It may help sometimes if we have kind of our palms up, that can be helpful. Again, aiming for a receiving stance. Now, what I'd love for you to do, aiming to keep that kind of receiving, listening posture, is to open back up your eyes again and look through the words that you've captured. I'm going to give us, maybe about 30 or 45 seconds of silence to read back through what you've written and to be listening for the one or two things, key themes, that you most sense God inviting you to pay more attention to. Just scan back through, look for the one or two that most resonate with a sense of consolation, if you're familiar with that term. Maybe it gives you a sense of life, something that seems aligned with what God has for you. All right, once you have those one or two key themes, I'm going to invite us to take another minute or so to begin to answer. What guidance might God have for me? How might He be encouraging me to live further into these one or two key themes. I'll give us another minute for that, and then we'll open it up to any sharing you may want. 10 more seconds. All right, we've only got a minute or two, but I would love to hear anything that shares your best sense of what God is asking you to walk away with. For myself, what stood out is this idea of life-giving activities. It relates kind of to another way I've known God working in my life, looking to build my consistent understanding of his love for me. That idea of God wanting me to pay more attention to what is life-giving and to lean in, resonate.
Yeah, I'll go, Tracy. I love, and it's not the first time I've heard it, but Michaela's letting water off the boat is a great metaphor. I'm all about metaphors and imagery and I think how that translates for me is how can we give grace to ourselves? I think we're taught a lot about giving grace to others and being gracious in our relationships. But I do think and believe deeply that we are also called to, and God encourages us to give grace to ourselves. And I don't think we do that very well. We're all about obligations and commitments and box checking, right? And so how do we give grace to ourselves, which then gives us the freedom to let a little water off the boat, right? And begin to move towards those things that are more life-giving. And so, hear this as permission to give grace to yourselves in the midst of this.
Thank you, Lisa.
Tracy, your word overreaction had an invitation to me, to my soul, and the word check the engine light. I too like those metaphors that just stick with me. And as I was listening to the word overreaction, because it had an invitation to it, and check the engine light, I've been talking about grief a lot, right? And teaching others about grief. And God just said that overreaction, which, I hate when I overreact or I'm sharp with my child or sharp, you're sharpest with those who love you and can't get away from you. And I heard God say, unprocessed grief comes out in undesirable ways. So that overreaction is just an invitation to go, oh, I haven't grieved. And to not be afraid of it, but just to go deeper. And so I am preaching this seminar to myself as well all the time, lest I become too comfortable that I have it all together. I don't.
Yeah.
And so your word overreaction and to check the engine light just gave me permission to turn that grief into grace and to give myself that grace to say, oh my goodness, it's caught up with me and I haven't processed what's been going on today or this week or this month. So thank you.
I hope that my word was permission to, and permission not to be in certain ways. And I hope for all of you who have joined us that you have felt God's permission to not, to do, to grieve, to lament. We're seeing tons of your words and your themes dropped in the chat, and certainly there's a flow and a resonance, and we really honor and mark even just how I will say the Spirit is moving in the commonality of what's in the chat. we are so grateful for you and for your hour that you've spent with us. There is a follow-up email that will come with links to different resources. We'll include something about a rule of life. Tracy has something. We have a link to what we call road ahead groups where people do more inner work. But mostly I'm really grateful for you three and really grateful for everyone who's been here today. So thanks for joining us and have a good day.
Thanks, Michaela.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy and Lisa. So great to be with you today. Thank you, Michaela.
Good to
and
be with
Abby
you
as well.
too.
Thank you.